When political firebrand Bernie Sanders, the outspoken senator and champion of progressive ideals, was forcibly removed from the set of Jimmy Kimmel Live, the political and entertainment worlds collided in a firestorm. What began as a platform to discuss Sanders' latest policy initiatives spiraled into a blistering confrontation, exposing a side of Jimmy Kimmel that obliterates his image as late night's affable everyman. In a calculated display of disdain, Kimmel baited Sanders with dismissive jabs, turning a policy discussion into a personal ambush that ended in chaos. This isn't just a talk show tiff. It's a raw exposé of late-night television's hidden agendas. Stick around as we unpack the shocking details, and make sure to subscribe and drop your thoughts in the comments, because this story reveals the real Jimmy Kimmel like never before. According to sources close to the production, the clash was brewing before Sanders even arrived at the studio. The senator, known for his no-nonsense demeanor, showed up prepared to discuss pressing issues like health care reform and economic inequality, topics he'd coordinated with producers to highlight. Bernie was all business, a crew member recalled. He was polite but focused, even taking time to thank the staff and ask about their work conditions. Sanders' team had emphasized keeping the segment substantive, and he spent the pre-show prep reviewing notes and engaging with the crew. But the mood soured when Kimmel swept in, visibly agitated and barely acknowledging Sanders. Insiders say the host was already bristling over recent criticism of his political commentary, and Sanders' presence seemed to set him off. Jimmy was muttering about preachy politicians and how he wasn't here to be lectured, a production assistant disclosed. He didn't even shake Bernie's hand during the pre-show meeting. This cold shoulder foreshadowed a showdown that would leave the audience stunned. When the show kicked off, the tension was immediate. Kimmel's introduction of Sanders was lackluster, a perfunctory nod that contrasted sharply with the crowd's enthusiastic cheers for the senator. As Sanders took the stage, his trademark intensity and earnestness electrified the room, but Kimmel remained seated, offering a limp handshake that felt more dismissive than welcoming. The divide was clear: Sanders, passionate and purposeful, versus Kimmel, detached and primed for conflict. The interview started with a softball question about Sanders' latest healthcare proposal, but Kimmel's tone quickly turned snide. "So, Bernie, you're still pushing this free healthcare thing," he said, smirking. "Don't you ever get tired of preaching the same old sermon?" The jab landed awkwardly, and the audience's laughter was sparse. Sanders, unfazed, leaned forward. "It's not preaching, Jimmy. It's fighting for people who can't afford to get sick. You'd understand if you spent a day in their shoes." The response drew applause, but Kimmel's smile didn't reach his eyes. Rather than engage, Kimmel doubled down. "Sure, but let's be real. Your plans sound great until the bill comes due," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're selling dreams, not reality." Sanders' eyes narrowed, but his voice stayed steady. "The reality is millions are drowning in medical debt while insurance companies rake in billions. That's the bill we're paying now, Jimmy. My plan just shifts the cost to fairness." The audience cheered, but Kimmel's expression tightened, clearly irked by Sanders' clarity. Insiders later noted that Kimmel seemed determined to derail Sanders. "He hates being outshone," a stage manager confided. Bernie's conviction threw him off, and Jimmy started digging for a weak spot. That's when Kimmel pivoted to a personal attack. "You've been at this forever, Bernie," he said, leaning forward. "Some people say you're just a loudmouth who loves the spotlight. How do you respond to that?" The accusation was out of nowhere, and the audience fell quiet, sensing the shift from policy to provocation. Sanders adjusted his glasses, his face a mask of controlled indignation. "I've spent my life fighting for working people, Jimmy," he said, his voice low but firm. "If that's loud, so be it. The real noise is the greed drowning out people's voices. I'm here to amplify them, not add to the chatter." The audience erupted, but Kimmel scoffed. "Amplify? Sounds like grandstanding to me. You ever think maybe people are tired of your revolution shtick? The dig was vicious, and Sanders' jaw tightened, his patience visibly thinning as the segment teetered on the edge of combustion. The commercial break descended like a storm cloud, but it did nothing to quell the brewing tempest. Backstage, Sanders' team huddled around him, urging caution, with one advisor whispering that Kimmel was baiting him into a soundbite trap. Sanders, his face set in a grim line, brushed off the concern. "I'm not here to play nice with bullies," he said, his voice steady but laced with resolve. Across the studio, Kimmel was locked in a tense exchange with his producer, who was pleading with him to pivot to lighter topics. "He's not going to lecture me on my own show," Kimmel reportedly snapped, his hands clenched. Crew members exchanged uneasy glances, one later admitting, "It felt like Jimmy was out for blood." When the cameras rolled again, the studio was a tinderbox. Kimmel flashed a strained smile, attempting a weak joke about the news cycle, but the audience's response was tepid, their attention fixed on the brewing clash. Sanders sat upright, his eyes locked on Kimmel, exuding a quiet intensity that seemed to rattle the host. "All right, Bernie," Kimmel said, his tone sharp with mockery. "Let's switch gears. You're always railing against the rich. Ever. Think you're just fueling class warfare? I mean, isn't that a bit divisive?" The question was loaded, designed to paint Sanders as a rabble-rouser. Sanders didn't blink. "Divisive is a system where billionaires hoard wealth while workers can't afford rent," he said, his voice measured but forceful. "I'm not starting a war, Jimmy. I'm calling out one that's been waged on the working class for decades." The audience erupted in applause, some standing, but Kimmel's face twitched with irritation. "Sure, but you make it sound so simple," he shot back, leaning forward. "Tax the rich, fix everything. Don't you think people see through that populist act by now?" The jab stung, and Sanders' eyes flashed with controlled anger. "It's not an act, Jimmy," he said, his voice rising slightly. "It's math. The top 1% own more than the bottom 90. You think that's fair? Or are you too busy cozying up to your elite pals to notice?" The audience gasped, then cheered, and Kimmel's smile vanished, his grip on the desk tightening. "Wow, okay. Personal much?" he said, his voice tight. "I'm just asking questions, Bernie. Maybe you're the one who can't handle a little scrutiny." Sanders leaned forward, his presence commanding the stage. "Scrutiny's fine, Jimmy," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "But you're not scrutinizing. You're sneering. I came here to talk about ideas that could save lives. Why are you so scared of that conversation?" The audience roared, and Kimmel's face reddened, his control slipping. "Scared?" he snapped, his voice cracking. "I'm not scared. I just think your whole revolution thing is a fantasy. People want practical, not pipe dreams." "Practical?" Sanders fired back, his voice booming now. "Practical is letting kids go hungry while corporations dodge taxes. My plans are funded, Jimmy. They're on my website. Have you read them? Or are you just parroting talking points?" The rebuke was a gut punch, and the audience exploded, chanting, "Bernie, Bernie!" Kimmel, visibly rattled, tried to laugh it off, but it came out hollow. "Oh, come on, Bernie, don't get all high and mighty," he said. "You're a politician. You're selling something, same as anyone. Like that time you ran for president and, what, tanked the party's chances?" The personal attack was vicious, dredging up old election controversies. Sanders' face hardened, his patience fraying. "I ran to give people a voice, Jimmy," he said, his voice low but searing. "I fought for what I believe in, and millions joined me. What do you stand for besides cheap shots and applause lines?" The audience went wild, some standing in ovation, but Kimmel's eyes widened, his composure crumbling. "Cheap shots?" he shouted, leaning forward. "You're on my show, Bernie. You don't get to lecture me like I'm some intern." Sanders didn't flinch. "I'm not lecturing," he said, his voice steady. "I'm calling you out. You invited me here to talk policy, then turned it into a circus. If you can't handle real issues, Maybe you shouldn't have a platform." The words landed like a sledgehammer, and Kimmel's face paled. The producer, now frantically signaling off stage, waved for a cut, but Kimmel barreled on. "You think you're so noble?" he snapped. "You're just a loud old man yelling at clouds. People are sick of it." Sanders stood, his small frame radiating authority. "I'm done, Jimmy," he said, his voice booming. "You want to mock people's struggles? Do it without me." The audience roared as the cameras cut to commercial, Kimmel's stunned silence echoing in the chaos. The commercial break was a pressure cooker, with the studio buzzing like a hive on the verge of collapse. Backstage, Sanders' team was in a heated debate, some urging him to walk out to avoid further escalation, others arguing he should stay, to expose Kimmel's tactics. Sanders, his face etched with determination, silenced the chatter. "I'm not running from this," he said, his voice low but unyielding. Across the stage, Kimmel was cornered by his executive producer, who was practically begging him to de-escalate or risk tanking the show's reputation. "He's making me look like a fool," Kimmel reportedly hissed, ignoring the warnings. Crew members, some openly rooting for Sanders, whispered about Kimmel's unraveling, one grip noting, "Jimmy's digging his own grave." When the show resumed, the audience was electric, their earlier cheers now mixed with a restless anticipation. Kimmel, his smile a thin veneer, tried to pivot with a forced quip about the weather, but the room stayed silent, all eyes on Sanders. The senator sat tall, his gaze locked on Kimmel, radiating a quiet fury that seemed to unnerve the host. "All right, Bernie," Kimmel said, his voice laced with barely concealed venom. "Let's try this again. You're always talking about fairness, but what about your own record? Like, didn't you dodge some taxes back in the day? Kind of hypocritical, no?" The accusation was a wild swing, pulling from a long-debunked rumor about Sanders' finances. Sanders' eyes narrowed, but he kept his composure. "That's a lie, Jimmy, and you know it," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "My taxes are public. I've fought for transparency my whole career. If you're going to sling mud, at least get your facts straight." The audience erupted, some chanting, "Bernie!" as Kimmel's smirk faltered. "I'm just asking what people are saying," he backpedaled, his tone defensive. "You've been in politics forever. There's got to be some dirt." Sanders leaned forward, his presence filling the stage. "People say what they're fed by folks like you," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "I've spent decades fighting for the powerless, not chasing scandals. You want dirt? Look at the system that lets billionaires buy influence while you mock the people trying to fix it." The audience roared, some standing, but Kimmel's face twisted with rage. "Oh, spare me the sermon, Bernie," he snapped. "You act like you're the only one who cares. Maybe people just don't buy your whole savior of the poor routine anymore." The personal dig was relentless, and Sanders' patience snapped. "You think this is a routine?" he said, his voice rising, with controlled fury. "I've been arrested for protesting injustice. I've marched for rights you take for granted. What have you done, Jimmy, besides cracking jokes for the elite?" The audience exploded, and Kimmel's hands clenched, his control crumbling. "Elite?" he shouted, leaning forward. "I'm out here every night talking to real people. You're the one living in some socialist fantasy land." Sanders didn't flinch. "Real people?" he fired back, his voice booming. "Real people are dying because they can't afford medicine. Real people are working 3 jobs to survive. You don't talk to them. You talk at them, and you mock anyone who dares challenge your bubble." The audience was on its feet, a mix of cheers and gasps filling the studio. Kimmel, now visibly unhinged, laughed harshly. "Challenge? You're not challenging, Bernie. You're grandstanding. Nobody wants your revolution. They want to laugh, not cry." Sanders stood, his small frame commanding the room. "I'm done, Jimmy," he said, his voice a thunderclap. "I came here to talk about saving lives, not to be your punching bag. You want laughs? Laugh at yourself because this is a disgrace. The audience roared, chanting, "Bernie! Bernie!" as Sanders turned to leave. Kimmel, panic flashing in his eyes, stood up, shouting over the noise. "Yeah, go ahead. Run. That's what you do when you can't win, right?" Sanders paused, turning back slowly, his eyes blazing. "I'm not running," Sanders said, his voice calm but searing. "I'm walking away from a stage that's lost its purpose. You're not a host, Jimmy. You're a gatekeeper who's forgotten who he's supposed to serve." The words landed like a knockout punch, and Kimmel's face paled. The producer, now on stage, tried to intervene, waving frantically for a cut, but Kimmel shoved past. "This is my show, Bernie," he yelled, his voice cracking. "You don't get to lecture me." Sanders, unfazed, took a step closer. "Then earn it, Jimmy. Stop hiding behind your desk and start listening to the people you claim to represent." The audience went wild as the cameras cut to commercial, Kimmel's stunned silence drowned out by the chaos. The commercial break was a maelstrom, with the studio teetering on the edge of anarchy. Backstage, Sanders' team was in a heated huddle, some pushing for an immediate exit to avoid further escalation, others arguing he should stay to cement his stand. Sanders, his face a mask of steely resolve, cut through the noise. "I'm not here to play their game," he said, his voice low but unwavering. Across the corridor, Kimmel was unraveling, ignoring his producer's desperate pleas to issue an apology or wrap the segment early. "He's not going to humiliate me," Kimmel reportedly shouted, his voice echoing through the hall. Crew members, some openly siding with Sanders, exchanged stunned looks, one PA whispering, "Jimmy's lost it completely." When the cameras rolled again, the atmosphere was combustible. Kimmel, his face flushed and smile forced, tried to regain control with a weak joke about passionate debates, but the audience's silence was deafening, their focus locked on Sanders. The senator stood near the stage's edge, his posture defiant, refusing to sit as a silent rebuke to Kimmel's antics. "All right, Bernie," Kimmel said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're clearly fired up, but let's talk about something real. Like, don't you think your ideas scare people? Free college? Free health care? It sounds like a handout to a lot of folks." The question was a deliberate jab, framing Sanders' policies as reckless giveaways. Sanders didn't hesitate. "What scares people, Jimmy, is a system that bankrupts them for getting sick," he said, his voice steady but forceful. "What scares them is working 40 years and retiring with nothing. My ideas aren't handouts, they're justice. You'd see that if you listened to your audience instead of mocking them." The audience erupted, some chanting, "Bernie," as Kimmel's jaw tightened, his control slipping further. "That's a nice speech," Kimmel shot back, leaning forward aggressively. "But let's be honest, you've been selling this for decades and you're still just a senator. Maybe people don't want what you're pushing." The personal dig was vicious, implying Sanders' career was a failure. Sanders' eyes blazed, but his voice stayed calm. "I'm a senator because people keep voting for me to fight for them," he said. "I don't need a corner office to make a difference. What's your excuse for wasting this platform on petty attacks?" The audience roared, and Kimmel's face reddened, his hands clenching the desk. "Petty?" Kimmel snapped, his voice rising. "You're the one turning my show into a soapbox. Maybe if you weren't so busy yelling about billionaires, you'd see why people tune in. To escape, not to be lectured." Sanders stepped forward, his presence towering despite his stature. "Escape?" he said, his voice booming. "People are drowning in debt, Jimmy. They're not escaping, they're surviving. If you can't talk about that, you're not entertaining. You're ignoring them." The audience was on its feet, a mix of cheers and gasps filling the studio. Kimmel, now visibly unhinged, stood up, his voice cracking with fury. "Ignoring them? I've been doing this for years, Bernie. I know my audience. You're the one out of touch, preaching like some prophet nobody asked for." Sanders didn't flinch. Nobody asked? He fired back, his voice a thunderclap. Millions are marching for change. They're begging for someone to listen. I'm here for them, not your ego. You want to keep ignoring them? That's your failure, not mine. The audience went wild, chanting, Bernie, Bernie! As Kimmel's face paled, his control shattered. The producer, now sprinting onto the stage, signaled frantically for a cut, but Kimmel barreled on. Failure? He shouted, his voice hoarse. You're a relic, Bernie. Your ideas are a joke, and you know it. Sanders turned to leave, his team already moving toward the exit. I'm done, Jimmy, he said, his voice calm but searing. You've shown everyone who you are tonight. Good luck living with that. Kimmel, desperate to reclaim the narrative, yelled after him. Yeah, walk away. That's what you do when you lose. Sanders paused, turning back one last time. I'm not losing, he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. I'm standing for something. Try it sometime. The audience erupted as Sanders exited, the cameras cutting to commercial just as Kimmel slumped into his chair, his face a mask of shock. Backstage, security appeared at Kimmel's behest, attempting to block Sanders' team. You need to wait, a guard said, but Sanders held up a hand. We're leaving, he said, his voice unyielding. Move, or explain to the world why you're stopping me. The guards, sensing the optics, stepped aside, and Sanders walked out, his team in tow, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. The backstage hallway was a crucible of tension as Sanders and his team strode toward the exit, their steps purposeful and unyielding. Security guards, caught in Kimmel's desperate bid to regain control, lingered uncertainly, but Sanders's commanding presence left no room for confrontation. Crew members lined the corridor, some nodding in quiet respect, others whispering about Kimmel's meltdown. Bernie owned him, one lighting tech muttered, shaking his head. Kimmel, trailing behind, his shirt rumpled and face flushed, called out, Bernie, wait! Let's talk this out! His voice cracked, a mix of panic and bravado, but Sanders didn't slow, his team forming a protective barrier. The head of security stepped forward, his tone hesitant. Senator, please, Mr. Kimmel just wants a word. Sanders stopped, turning slowly, his eyes locking onto the guard with an intensity that silenced the hallway. I gave him plenty of words, he said, his voice low and resolute. He chose to waste them. We're done. The guard glanced at the producer, who'd caught up, visibly frazzled. Senator, this doesn't have to escalate, the producer pleaded, but Sanders cut him off. It already has, he said. Your host turned a chance for real talk into a personal attack. That's not on me. Kimmel pushed forward, his voice rising. Come on, Bernie, don't play the martyr, he said, his tone shifting to a forced calm. It's just a show. Things got heated, that's all. Let's shake hands, move on. Sanders turned fully, his gaze piercing. Heated? He said, his voice steady but searing. You mocked the struggles of millions, Jimmy. You dismissed ideas that could save lives, all to stroke your ego. That's not heat. That's cowardice. The words landed like a hammer, and Kimmel flinched, his attempt at reconciliation crumbling. Cowardice? Kimmel sputtered, his face reddening. I've been doing this for decades. You think you can come in here and lecture me because you've got a fan club? Sanders stepped closer, his small frame radiating authority. I'm not lecturing, he said. I'm telling you the truth. You had a platform to lift people up, to talk about what matters. You chose to tear me down instead. That's not hosting, it's betrayal. The hallway fell silent, crew members exchanging stunned looks as Kimmel's jaw worked soundlessly, no retort forthcoming. The producer, desperate to end the standoff, tried to intervene. Senator, please, let's just... But Sanders held up a hand, silencing him. I came here for your audience, not your host, he said. They deserve better than this circus. With that, he turned and pushed through the exit doors, his team following, leaving Kimmel frozen in the corridor, his face a mask of shock and humiliation. A young PA clutching a clipboard approached Sanders as he reached the door. "Senator, thank you," she said quietly. "You said what a lot of us feel." Sanders paused, his expression softening. "Keep fighting," he said simply, then stepped into the night. The fallout was cataclysmic. Clips of the confrontation flooded social media, racking up millions of views within hours. Kimmel Unmasked and Bernie Strong trended worldwide as viewers and insiders dissected Kimmel's collapse. Anonymous crew members leaked stories of his backstage tantrums and disdain for guests who challenged him, painting a portrait of a host, undone by his own hubris. The network scrambled, issuing a vague statement about reviewing the episode, but whispers of emergency meetings and potential sanctions swirled. Sanders, true to form, stayed focused, declining follow-up interviews. His team released a brief statement. Senator Sanders appreciates the support and remains committed to fighting for working people. Supporters flooded his platforms, praising his unflinching stand, while activists coined "pulling a Bernie" for confronting power with unyielding principle. Kimmel's show hemorrhaged viewers, with publicists pulling guests and sponsors re-evaluating ties, wary of his toxic turn. Kimmel's attempt at damage control, a half-hearted social media post, blaming a lively exchange, imploded, buried under comments lauding Sanders and slamming Kimmel's deflection. The mask was off, revealing a host who thrived on control, but buckled when faced with conviction. The clash was a stark reminder that in a world of spin, truth cuts deepest, and real power lies in standing for something bigger than a soundbite. What do you make of this explosive showdown between Bernie Sanders and Jimmy Kimmel? Was Kimmel's behavior indefensible, or did Sanders push too hard? Drop your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more unfiltered stories, and hit that notification bell to never miss a video. We'll see you in the next one.